Welcome to the fourth installment of Answer San Diego's First Friday Forum series. For Black History Month edition, we'll be taking a look at the history of police militarization and analyzing how it still impacts Black people and other oppressed communities today from San Diego to Denver and beyond. My name is Lau Batalona, and I'm an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Tonight, I'll be joined by two speakers, Reem Zubeidi of Answer San Diego, and our special guest, Joel Northam of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Joel is facing 42 years in prison over trumped-up charges related to peaceful protests he and his comrades led in Aurora, Colorado, demanding justice for Elijah Mclain last year. Elijah Lucero and Lillian House, two other Denver PSL members and movement leaders, are similarly facing decades in prison. As with several cities across the country, 2020 was a historic year for Aurora. In August 2019, the Aurora Police Department killed Elijah Mclain and thought they could get away with it. Democrat and former District Attorney Dave Young didn't file any charges against the killer cops. Aurora PD even kept them on the job. The city aided in blocking Elijah Mclain's family from receiving any sort of restitution for torture and the death of the 23-year-old man. The PSL has been fighting for justice for Elijah Mclain in solidarity with the Mclain family since then. The struggle erupted in 2020 when the anti-racist uprising swept the nation. Over 5,000 people gathered outside Aurora PD's headquarters on June 27th before taking over the freeway in what became Aurora's largest protest ever. That evening, a peaceful violent vigil was held for Elijah. It was violently broken up by heavily militarized cops, as seen in the videos that promptly went viral and inspired similar music vigils for Elijah Mclain across the globe. Mass protests continued the whole summer, which were hounded by police and right-wing thugs. Someone even attempted to drive a Jeep through the crowd during the freeway protests on July 25th. The only reason nobody was killed is because of a heroic man who crashed his truck into the Jeep to buy the crowd more time to clear the freeway. However, these acts of police and vigilante terrorism did not quell the movement. On September 17th, collaborating police agencies conducted militarized arrests of several leaders of the movement in Aurora, including 4 PSL members. They illegally held Lillian House, Joel Northam, and Elijah Lucero in jail for 8 days under 23-plus-hour lockdown in unlivable conditions. The Aurora DAs at the time, Dave Young and George Brauchler, charged the organizers with felonies and misdemeanors worth decades in prison, all for legal, peaceful protests. This is an effort to terrorize the movement, to paralyze and demobilize all who dare to protest against racism. But the arrested leaders and protesters have not been scared into silence. In November 21st march on Colorado State Capitol denouncing the governor's move to water down the investigation into Elijah Mclain's murder led to Governor Polis reversing the changes to the investigation within days. And that movement for justice continues, having a protest as recently as January 21st, and maybe more since then. I'm sure Comrade Joel will update us. Though not currently as dynamic as the movement in Aurora, we had protests here in San Diego numbering in the thousands as well, including a Defund the Police rally on June 13th, organized by the PSL San Diego, which had about 2,000 people marching through downtown. A June 4th protest just over a week earlier numbered almost 7,000 and ended in what became a viral video of Shayla Pickney being abducted and taken away in an unmarked minivan. The San Diego iteration of the nationwide rebellion against racism began with the La Mesa uprising on May 30th in response to the assault of Amari Johnson by former officer Matt Dages of the La Mesa Police Department. Recently, Dages' appeal for a rehire was denied and charges have been filed against him for writing a false report. This victory could not have happened without the countless protests that took place across San Diego County. Another victory for the local movement came recently when a struggle to release jailed community organizer Denzel Drawn led to his bail being lowered, thus at least temporarily winning his freedom. His charges have since been dropped. PSL San Diego has been on the front lines of that struggle as well. If you'd like to join, donate, or stay updated on the PSL's efforts, you can head to ilnktr.ee/PSL San Diego. It is clear that the police under capitalism serve to oppress, not protect the working class and oppressed people. And the new Biden and Harris administration supports giving away more money to police, dismissing the righteous demand to defund police as an anarchist fantasy. The increased militarization of police in recent decades goes hand in hand with the racist institutions that policies which increase police funding and facilitate mass incarceration. Take Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill, for example. In order to fully understand why police responded to last year's protests of police violence with, well, more police violence, we must study the history of police militarization in this country. Reem is going to talk to us about the historical connections between police militarization and the racist mass incarceration. Reem Zubeidi is an organizer with the Answer Coalition here in San Diego. Answer was formed following the 9/11 attacks in anticipation of a rise of in Islamophobia and warmongering. Answer helped launch the massive anti-war movement against the US invasion of Iraq. Since then, Answer has organized against blockades of Cuba and Venezuela, occupations of Palestine, Afghanistan, and Korea, and the US drone strikes and bombings of Syria and Yemen, among many other important issues. Multiple Answer Coalition organizers were part of the Venezuelan Embassy Protection Collective. Answer also organized a nationwide response to the escalation of US war on Iran last year. On January 16th, Answer San Diego and PSL held a speak out and banner drop in City Heights demanding an end to both AFRICON and the war on Somalia. Reem was a part of that organizing action. Thanks for joining us, Reem. Welcome.
Thank you, Lyle. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So in order to gain an understanding of the history of police militarization, we need to take a look at what was happening in the 1960s in the US. At this time, the public was becoming more engaged in public affairs and were considered a serious threat to the existing order of Jim Crow apartheid. This was a time of activism for a lot of things, including anti-racism and the civil rights marches, anti-war protest, feminism, and environmentalism. A lot of these protesters were people of color fighting as part of the civil rights campaigns in Birmingham and Selma. You had Martin Luther King's anti-war march on the Pentagon, demonstrations after the infamous Kent State shooting, where the National Guard opened fire on a crowd of students protesting the US war on Vietnam, killing 4 of them, among many other issues. So members of the ruling class saw these movements as a danger and in response called for a counterattack to stop the rising tide of revolution. These are the words of Lewis Powell, a big tobacco lawyer who later became a Supreme Court justice. In August 1971, he sent a memo titled Attack on American Free Enterprise System, which became known as the Powell Memorandum. The memo called for capitalist corporations to do something to stop the communists, new leftists, and other anti-imperialist revolutionaries. This made the revolutionary movements at the time the direct enemy of the fundamental institutions of society that capitalist corporations need to uphold in order to exist. That includes the government, private market, the military, police, nuclear family, and white supremacy. And he called on all capitalist corporations to uphold the system in all arenas, including advertising and in the education system. Of course, these movements were in response to critical issues that people were facing at the time, and you can draw parallels with today's struggles. Today, nearly 2.5 million people are incarcerated in US jails and prisons. Another 30 to 40 million people are facing eviction once the moratorium lifts, and nearly 500,000 people have had their lives taken by COVID. Not unlike the rhetoric Joe Biden and Kamala Harris just ran on, the conservative response to political revolution in the 1960s was a call for law and order. Reactionary politicians associated mass protest movements with criminality and the dangers of the ghetto when talking about the Black liberation movement. Fascist organizations like the KKK terrorized anti-racist and communist organizations in collaboration with police agencies across the country, with the support of many Dixiecrats and Republicans. Nixon ran on this idea of the return to law and order and called upon the trope of the silent majority, which he aimed to construct as his base. The silent majority was portrayed as the law-abiding, patriotic, and hardworking Americans whose interests were overshadowed by rioters, radicals, hippies, and traitors. It was also very clearly a racist slogan that aimed to take white suburbanites, blue-collar workers, and Southerners away from the Democratic Party coalition. This became a point of unity for Republicans who differed on economic policies, as well as white ethnic local Democratic Party machines across the country that were hostile to the rise of Black liberation politics. Instead of addressing the systemic causes of the problems people were facing at the time, which were legitimate problems caused by capitalism, including rising drug addiction, poverty, and other social problems, the ruling class attributed these to the effects of the individual. These had to be addressed through the corrective methods of the criminal justice system. This response was tied directly to the militarization of the police, harsher and expanded imprisonment techniques, and the elimination of programs aimed at alleviating poverty and other social problems. Between 1966 and 1976, criminal justice expenditures increased at 5 times the rate they had in the past decade. The number of police grew almost 40% nationally. In 1974, $15 billion were spent on criminal justice, 57% going directly to police expenditures. Federally, Nixon put in place the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration to funnel large amounts to local police agencies. Between 1968 and 1972, this federal agency received $1.5 billion in federal funds, including $850 million in 1972 alone. The growing revolutionary movement was the biggest target of these policies, especially Black-led communist organizations like the Black Panther Party, who were called anarchistic criminals, referred to as hoodlums by the Justice Department, and called the greatest threat to America's internal security. As part of the plan to restore law and order, COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, was ramped up to undermine radical movements through subterfuge and extreme violence. The FBI and local police units declared war on radicals and militant groups from nationally oppressed communities. This is also the time when the SWAT team was first formed in LA in response to the Black Panther Party offices. So we have the law and order rhetoric used to this day that helped justify counter-revolutionary work and increase the prison population and criminalization of protest. Under Barack Obama, this country saw arguably its biggest wave of police militarization ever in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the rebellions in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland. Though offering passive rhetorical support to the movement, the Obama-Biden administration cracked down on anti-racist protesters. Not to mention that Obama proudly signed what was essentially an alarmist Blue Lives Matter bill into law. Militarized policing has become the status quo. It remains to this day as a massive apparatus that keeps itself going by constantly creating new wars, from the war on revolutionaries to the war on drugs to the war on terror. In addition, these policies and practices of suppression of radical social movements considerably weakened those who would have been the biggest obstacles to the mass incarceration policies and police repression against Black America. Tactics which we see to this day in places like Philadelphia, Denver, and even here in San Diego. Last summer in Philadelphia, a protest organized by the Party for Socialism and Liberation on June 6th turned into a war zone when police kettled and trapped protesters along a fence and proceeded to drown the crowd in tear gas. This assault by police came just minutes after an order was given to the city of Philadelphia by the Trump administration to crack down on their protest movement. It's a miracle nobody died. However, this violent repression did not quell the protest. The following weekend, PSL called another protest alongside other socialist and anti-racist organizations in Philadelphia. An estimated 100,000 people packed the streets in response to the terror campaign being waged against the anti-racist movement by Philadelphia police. It was a historic day which barely got any mainstream news coverage. As I previously alluded to, these repressive policies and practices are not limited to the US, but are exported to other countries, including Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, and Palestine, in more places where police train alongside the military. In Afghanistan, for example, the US military and US-backed Afghan police work together on night raids. Israeli forces, funded by the US, regularly use tear gas and rubber bullets on the Palestinian civilians. Similarly, Saudi Arabia, America's biggest arms buyer, is supplied with weapons by the US to continue its assault on Yemen. This week, the Biden administration pledged to stop supporting and participating in offensive Saudi attacks on Yemen, but shifted the language to say that the US would continue to support and help Saudi Arabia defend its sovereignty. So arms sales can continue, but instead be classified as for defensive purposes. It's also important to note that despite the vast capabilities of the police agencies in DC to defend the Capitol building with a militarized response, as they did when 100,000 people led by anti-war veterans protested the Iraq War, only a fifth of the usual capacity of the Capitol Police was deployed on January 6th. Many officials claimed they thought a heavy police presence would be bad optics, but that's mostly a lie. We now know that the police not only had prior knowledge of this publicly planned attempt to negate the certification of the November 3rd election, but that top law enforcement officials like Paul Irving ignored or refused any request to send in heavy backup or the National Guard. The action was also supported by many top Republicans and even the Republican Attorney General Association. Donald Trump, his family, Clarence Thomas's wife, and many other conservative figureheads cheered on this fascist insurrection until it was widely condemned by the US ruling class for being an embarrassment to imperialism and their sham democracy. And despite this, it was not until several days later when arrests were finally made and some charges were filed against participants, but not the leaders or instigators of the action. Imagine if thousands of armed workers led by organizations like Answer, PSL, or American Indian Movement stormed the Capitol and shut down Congress by threatening to lynch its members. Would they be treated with such restraint? So we know that police militarization is not just a local or historical issue, but instead is an integral part of the capitalist imperialist state and its efforts to suppress progressive voices of dissent and make it more difficult for revolutionaries to organize. It's with this context that we must understand the struggle against mass incarceration and police militarization. This is what organizers mean when we say that racism and police brutality are systemic. It's not simply a Trump or Biden problem. The struggle against capitalist imperialism goes hand in hand with the struggle against racism. The ruling class operates on this basis, and so should we if we hope to out-organize them and end racist police terror. So consider getting involved and joining an anti-imperialist organization like the Answer Coalition or Party for Socialism and Liberation today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that presentation, Reem. And our final speaker for the night is Joel Northam. Joel was a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Denver. He grew up in Colorado Springs. The execution of the innocent prisoner Troy Davis in 2011 pushed Joel to become politically active. Since then, he's been deeply involved in community organizing. While living in Brooklyn, he helped many families organize for justice for victims of police murder. In 2020, he moved back to Colorado to help build the mass movement against police terror in the Denver area. He's faced militarized police retaliation for his organizing efforts, notably the SWAT team, which arrested Joel at his home on September 17th. Despite retaliation from the state, he's still leading the fight for justice in Aurora. Welcome, Joel. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us.
Thank you, comrade, and thank you, Answer San Diego, for allowing me to speak to y'all, inviting me. Again, like the comrade said, my name is Joel. I'm in the Denver branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. As mentioned before, the police and the local authorities here in the Denver area who we brought serious unwanted attention to are wielding the so-called justice system against us. On September 17th, multiple Denver area police forces led a coordinated series of arrests against local anti-racist organizers. Several activists were rounded up that day and taken to jail, 4 PSL members and another activist who we've worked closely with since fall 2019. 3 of us, Lillian, Elijah, and I, we were held for 8 days. We're being hit with a slew of false, very serious charges relating to nonviolent protests, which we led over the course of this summer, demanding justice for Elijah Mclain, a young Black man who was murdered by Aurora police officers in August 2019. If you're unfamiliar with this case, Elijah was a 23-year-old Black man who was killed while walking home in his own neighborhood. He was unarmed, not committing any crime, and not suspected of committing any crime. Someone called the police to report someone who looked suspicious because Elijah was dancing to music while walking, and he had a mask on, which he wore for blood circulation because he was anemic. The caller specifically stated that they did not believe he was dangerous, but nonetheless, 3 Aurora police officers rolled up on Elijah and within moments had forced him onto the ground using the now banned carotid chokehold. The 3 officers then knelt on Elijah's 140-pound handcuffed body and tortured him for over 15 minutes, at one point even threatening to have police dogs attack him, while Elijah suffered, vomited, and begged for his life. And yet, apparently unsatisfied with how dominated Elijah was, the police then directed paramedics to inject Elijah with ketamine, which is a horse tranquilizer. They shot him with a dose large enough to sedate a man twice his size, and that triggered multiple cardiac arrests. Between the massive dose of ketamine and the physical abuse of the officers, Elijah lost his life. Despite the fact that the assaulting officer's body-worn cameras all conveniently fell off, the entire scene is caught on video. And yet the district attorney, Dave Young, declined to press any charges against Elijah's killers. The officers weren't even taken off the job. One of the 3 killers has since been fired for a different offense after it was leaked that he was part of a scandal involving photos mocking Elijah's death, which was in that the trailer that you just watched. The other 2 killers remain active. They're active duty Aurora police officers, living their best lives. We've been protesting Elijah's murder alongside his family and other community members since it first happened 14 months ago. But his case really didn't gain traction or significant media attention until this summer, when the police murder of George Floyd lit off the mass protest movement that swept the entire country. And so we all saw how Denver had huge numbers of people in the streets from the beginning, but Aurora, which is like I don't want to say it's a suburb of Denver. It's just like suburbs and like strip malls, but it's right next to Denver. Aurora was pretty much untouched until we decided to call a march there on June 27th, demanding justice for Elijah and criminal charges against his killers. By the time the protest was held, people all around the country and even around the world were learning about Elijah's story. On the day of the action, more than 5,000 people turned out, including several national major media outlets. We marched onto the I-225 highway, which is one of the major thoroughfares in the Denver Aurora area, signaling that we were prepared and capable of bringing business as usual to a halt over the injustices in our city. This demonstration alone was groundbreaking in Aurora. But we didn't stop there. Throughout the entire summer, we continued to lead a mass, nonviolent, sustained protest movement, the likes of which Aurora has never seen. We had taken over highways and we led massive car protests with hundreds of cars. We led a 5-mile march uniting the cities of Aurora and Denver and calling for justice for the local victims of police terror, as there are several in Denver as well. Millions of people now know Elijah Mclain's name, and DA Dave Young's office has been flooded with the demand to prosecute Elijah's killers. Had been. He's no longer the DA, but we'll get into that later. The president of the Aurora Police Union told the press that APD was facing a severe crisis of morale with record numbers of officers quitting or retiring. This is why we're being targeted, because we had built a movement that is truly shaking the racist establishment here. The attack against us was a highly calculated effort involving months of surveillance, spearheaded by DA Dave Young, and involving several local police departments and another neighboring district attorney. They had not seen a movement of this magnitude before, and as a result, they were acting like a predator that's been backed into a corner. On their back foot, but still dangerous. The unwillingness of local, state, and federal authorities to provide relief for people during the pandemic and the resultant growing dissatisfaction thereof, combined with growing calls to defund the police, who are the guardians of this capitalist system, has produced for racist political establishments everywhere a sense of being besieged. So it has been incredible to be a part of the movement here, to be in the streets with the people of Aurora as they stood up against the brutality and impunity of the cops who patrol our streets. The Aurora Police Department is notorious for its viciousness and brutality, and the people here have taken it long enough. Thousands of people stayed in the streets for months throughout the summer, continuing to fight even in the face of intimidation and brute force. This kind of movement truly threatened the impunity of the police, and they were well aware of it. So here we are, months out from our arrests, knowing that from our very first protest in Aurora, APD was closely surveilling us, working to build a case that would shut down these protests that were happening against them. The charges they came up with, all tied to peaceful protests over a number of months, are some of the most extreme in the country. Of those arrested, Lillian, Eliza, and myself are being hit with particularly extreme charges. We are being charged many times over with inciting riots, directing riots, and engaging in riots, as well as obstructing government operations, attempting to influence a public agent, and the particularly outrageous attempted first-degree kidnapping charge for holding a protest outside a police station. I'll repeat that. Attempted first-degree kidnapping charge for holding a protest outside a police station. In total, I myself have been charged with 23 crimes, including 11 felonies, all attached to these protests. Lillian with nearly the same number. Our comrade Eliza is also facing several felonies and misdemeanors, and the other activists arrested are battling felonies and misdemeanors as well. If convicted and given the max, I could serve as many as 42 years in prison. Not one of these charges is valid. So we're being targeted not because we committed any crimes, but because we've been able to build a movement that is exposing the gangsterish criminality of those in power. And this attack is designed not just to take out the leadership of these protests, but to strike fear in the movement as a whole, demonstrating the police and the DEA's power to arbitrarily abduct, imprison, and charge activists who engage in protests against them. Every element of this attack has been designed to inflict the highest degree of fear. Our arrests on September 17th were carried out in a highly sensational and public manner. As the comrade mentioned before, they actually brought a tank, or more accurately, it's an MRAP vehicle, which is a mine-resistant anti-personnel or ambush-protected vehicle, because I apparently have landmines in my apartment parking lot. And so they sent that and multiple SWAT teams to arrest me. They pounded on my door and refused to show me a warrant. I was on the phone with a lawyer who advised me to give myself over without seeing the warrant, because she was genuinely concerned that the longer I waited, the police were just going to bust down the door and assault or potentially kill me. Excuse me. I was then toted out in front of my entire apartment building with all the neighbors watching. Lillian was driving just 5 miles from her home when she was surrounded by multiple police vehicles and arrested right there on the street. Eliza, just minutes later from my arrest, had a team of cops show up to her door and demand her surrender. After these arrests, the three of us were then jailed and deliberately denied our right to a bond hearing for 8 days, which I think the statute is, 48 hours you're supposed to see a judge. We were there for 8 days. We were held in COVID-exposed jail units under 23-hour lockdown in degrading conditions with no information about why we were being held for so long or when we would be released. People were just being cycled in and out. We were just there, So it was thanks to the immense political and legal pressure generated by the movement that we were finally released. But the authorities who contrived this attack had severely miscalculated. This movement is not easily swayed. And we have shown that we have the organizational capacity to withstand these repressive attacks and fight back as a movement and as an organization. But the fact remains that this was just the beginning of our battle, and we have a long and serious fight ahead of us. As we've seen in Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia, DC, Minneapolis, Louisville, Portland, Seattle, this is not an isolated struggle. The forces of the state across the country are leading a coordinated assault on protest leaders intended to crush the movement that sprung up this past summer that has shaken the very centers of ruling class power in this country. This is a reactionary wave that's happening right now. It's been calculated that as many as 26 million people took part in protests in some 2,500 cities and towns in the first weeks following George Floyd's killing. Imagine the fear of the police and the ruling class they serve when seemingly overnight a movement took shape which shook the ruling class centers of power and caused great shifts in consciousness. The vast movement reaching all corners of the country, uniting people of every age, every nationality, anchored in the resistance of Black working class young people, in many ways represents an embryonic form of what a revolutionary movement in this country would look like. We're not there yet, but truly you can make a revolution with those numbers. While maybe the people of this country don't grasp this, the ruling class in this country certainly does, and that is why they're cracking down with such fervor. We do not look to the Biden administration with hope or relief, Biden is part of the same ruling class establishment that is threatened by any movement of working class power. He has made it explicit that he aligns with Trump on his approach towards protests, and he intends to prosecute protesters with the full force of his administration. He also has top cop Kamala Harris as VP. Likewise, here in Aurora, the case against us was launched with the combined effort of a Democratic and a Republican DA, George Brockler and Dave Young. Dave Young is a Democrat. The guy that was like, oh, it was just excited delirium, Democrat. Demonstrating how both parties of the ruling class are united in their determination to crush movements of working class power. But on our side, we have the whole of the working class, every poor and oppressed person who has an interest in fighting this unjust system, in ending the impunity of the police and protecting our right to resist. If we are to defeat these charges and any attack against our progress, we have to unite in defense of one another. This will be an important lesson for the struggle ahead when the movement is certain to face more repression. Repression and revolution go hand in hand. We shouldn't be discouraged by repression. We should expect that as we grow as a force that represents a real threat to this unjust system. The ruling class will lash out in many ways to stop us. What counts is how we respond to it as a movement, whether we are able to not just overcome it, but even use it to drive forward the struggle. So that's it for me. Many thanks to the San Diego comrades for holding this event and giving me the opportunity to connect with you all in the struggle in your city and discuss how we can defeat these attacks so that we can continue to push forward stronger in this fight. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joel. Such an incredible presentation, and we are with you in demanding not only justice for Elijah Mclain and the dropping of your charges, but also working towards the abolition of police in all capitalist institutions. To our guests and our viewers, please consider donating to the Denver Defense Fund, which will be linked in the chat. It is crucial that we come together to support the comrades in Denver. This could set a very dangerous precedent for all anti-racist activists and organizers. You can also help by having your organization sign on to the demand to drop the charges, which you will find linked in the chat. You can also sign on your trade union or as a trade unionist, and you can sign the petition as an individual. Visit denverdefense.org to find out more ways you can support. Really thank you to the speakers, everyone who's attended the forum and everyone who made this forum happen. Huge thanks to our special guest, Comrade Joel Northam, for joining us from Colorado. The struggle to end police militarization, mass incarceration, racism, and capitalism continues, and so does our revolutionary optimism, no better kind of displayed by Joel tonight. So thank you, and have a great weekend, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining us.
Our comrades, take care. Power to the people.